Bleeding the braking system, how many times have you heard of it, or how many times have you thought you would like to try your hand at it, but without really understanding what procedures to do? I'm Alex, and in this video I want to show you the most correct procedure for bleeding your motorcycle's brake system. We have already seen in another video, I leave you below in the description the link to go then to see it, what are the problems that we can encounter using the brake system of our motorcycle. One of these problems, the most common one, is vapor loco, which is the formation of small bubbles of gas plane inside the circuit. Therefore, a bleeding of the brake system circuit is necessary to remedy this problem. Today we will see how best to perform this bleeding. We can pursue two ways. One is the traditional way, which is to perform the bleeding without help from any kind of equipment or apparatus. Or we can help with vacuum pumps that do nothing but create vacuum inside the circuit so that the oil and air is sucked in rather than pushed out by the pump. We are going to see today what procedure number one is, so the so-called traditional one, the one without any help. Let's go and see what we need. So we will need obviously a good brand brake oil, a wrench to go to open the bleeder of our bike. So here, according to the pump or the caliper, the suitable wrench, of course, a pair of gloves, because it is good to preserve your hands from the brake fluid that is particularly aggressive, some paper to clean the affected area because something will always happen, and then a simple tool that I built myself, as I think everyone has built themselves, which is nothing more than a jar with a tube, possibly transparent. Transparent because we will then have to go through the tube to see the oil coming out and any air bubbles present. A small note about the brake fluid: it should always be used by taking it from a new can. It is also written, if you pay attention on the pump lids, you should always use a new oil. And from an opened can, in the least amount of time possible, I, as a habit, write the day I open it with the marker on the can. If more than a week goes by, 10 days, what is left, I throw it away and open a new can. This is because of the strong hygroscopicity of brake fluid. It accumulates and absorbs moisture that would then go on to create problems later in the use of the bike. So new can of oil, or at least newly opened, and let's get started. The first thing we are going to do is open the cap of the master cylinder, reservoir. In this case, we are going to bleed a front brake system, so we remove the screws or the side plate, depends on the type of motorcycle, and carefully open the cap. Carefully, and being careful not to drip oil on the dashboard, that would hurt a lot. After that, we remove the rubber cap protecting the bleeder. The bleeder is usually located at the top of the caliper, starting with the right caliper, or the left caliper is quite indifferent. On some systems with ABS, the procedures from diagnosis indicate which caliper to start with, but for the purposes of our bleeding in this case, it is absolutely indifferent. We position our wrench so that there is then a way to turn so that it can be unscrewed and screwed. We position it in this way, and we go to sock the tube in our can. At this point, we are ready to start the bleeding. Essential that the tube is tight, that it is not soft, because otherwise out would come out the fluid going to dirty, and if it is not removed immediately, also stain calipers rather than the rim, etc. So now we hold one hand on the brake master cylinder and one hand on the bleeder. We press the brake lever. We hold in pressure. We go to open, and we will see the oil come out of the small tube. Without absolutely release the lever, then holding it down, we close the bleeder again. No need to tighten it very hard. Just point it so that no air is sucked in. The moment we go to release the lever, we start again. We go 2, 3, 4 pumps on the lever and repeat the operation. Then we hold in pressure, gently open the bleeder, and watch the oil come out, after which we always close before releasing the lever. An eye obviously always on the reservoir because it will go down the level. We have to avoid it emptying. going to suck air again, going to frustrate everything we are doing. So we continue. We are going to replace the oil in this way. As a matter of practice, as a matter of my custom, I bleed an entire pan on one caliper, bleed an entire pan on the other caliper, and if there is a bleed on the master cylinder as well, one on the brake master cylinder as well. So we continue in this way until we see only oil coming out and there is no more air bubbles. When we are satisfied of the bleeding we are doing. So when we see only oil coming out with no air bubbles, then we can stop. Go gently to disconnect the tube, being careful, because at this time is when the oil, the fluid, will tend to get all dirty. So we're going to hold the tube as low as we can so that the oil in the tube will go down into the can. Then very gently we're going to remove it from the bleeder fitting, this way holding it up so we haven't made a single drop of oil. We remove the wrench. We take our paper and give it a wipe. If we have a brake cleaner available, even better. We give it a spray, and after that we can go and put our plastic cap back on. The same operation will have to be repeated on the other caliper. We always keep an eye on the pump reservoir to prevent it from emptying, and we go to refill it as we go along with the bleeding. In case the reservoir remains empty, it would then be a problem because the system would suck air in again. So in this case, we would have to repeat the bleeding procedures. Remember the two basic things about this step, that we should never for any reason release the brake lever when we have an open bleeder. So we are pumping, we hold pressure, we open the bleeder, the lever will come down, it will come towards the knob. Here, before we release the lever, we should always make sure that we have closed the bleeder screw. If we don't do that, the moment we go to release the lever, the system from the bleeder could suck air back in, defeating the work done so far. So maximum attention to this aspect. Another aspect absolutely to always keep an eye on, because it's a moment that we get distracted, is the fluid level in the reservoir. Same thing, we go ahead with the bleed. We don't realize that the reservoir is going to empty the moment it gets to the tube that brings the fluid to the pump there. The moment we go to release, even if we would have closed the bleed at the bottom in the calipers, it will be sucked air right from our reservoir of our reservoir. So always keep an eye on both things. Well, at this point we have finished the bleed. How much fluid do we put inside the reservoir? Well, it depends. If we have new pads, as in this case, then we're going to put the fluid level just below the maximum mark in the case. Instead, we have worn pads, pads that are not new. We should adjust the example pad to 50%. We can be more or less in the middle between the minimum and maximum. The important thing is to never go below the minimum, whether with new or old pads. A very important consideration, brake fluid is never topped up. If we end up with the fluid in the reservoir at a very low level, it is a clear sign that we have worn brake pads. Brake pads, when they wear out, decrease in their thickness, therefore forcing the pistons and calipers to work more out than when they are new. This, of course, will require more fluid, and consequently will be recalled from the circuit, going to lower the level of the reservoir. So in this case, we check the wear of the pads, but never top off the brake fluid. As you have seen, carrying out the bleeding of the brake system is not a very difficult operation. However, it takes a little bit of attention and concentration. So as always, if you feel like doing this job well, otherwise I recommend the one to turn to a professional. The expense of doing a brake system bleeding is not an excessive stuff. It takes little time to do it. Brake fluid is used relatively little and does not have an excessive cost. So if we want to do it well, but if only we have doubts, or if we do not feel like doing it from a professional, and we will go away quickly. I remind you that with brakes, we really don't mess around at all. If instead we were in the conditions mentioned beginning of the video, or that of having to fill and bleed a completely empty system because we have replaced the hoses rather than overhauled the calipers or the master cylinder here. In that case, clearly if we could help ourselves with a pressure pump, it would all be much faster and easier, but we will still be able to do an effective bleeding even with the traditional system just illustrated. So with just a little more patience and a little more time, we will still be able to bleed it. A separate discussion deserves the latest generation of motorcycles with ABS, where often in order to properly bleed the brake system, we will need to enter the ECU through a diagnostic system and go to start a brake bleeding procedure. This procedure puts the solenoids inside the ABS control unit into operation so that we are able to drain and bleed the whole circuit, including just the ABS control unit. In this case, my advice is always to go to a professional. First, because it is not easily available a diagnostic system that can do these operations. So we should go on professional products, of which cost is, I would say, very high. And second, because that ABS system with the electronics of the latest generation of motorcycles is always better to leave it to a professional. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. I invite you, if you haven't already done so, to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to be notified with a notification every time I publish a new content about our motorcycles. I also invite you to follow me on my Instagram and Facebook socials, M-Racing Ignorant Motorcycles. That's all for today too. We will see you next time, and thank you.